You know, you got to watch preachers. They do a little housekeeping up here. My thumb drive is up here. You got to watch. Didn't give that back to me. I'm sure it was an honest oversight. But not taking any chances because I might forget about it if I don't take. You know how it is. You got to do something while you're thinking about it, or you just forget it. It's so good to be with you. Hammond is just like another home congregation anyway. We have had a relationship for so many years. You, in the past, have helped support me when I needed some outside support, and you have always been encouraging to me in view of holding up my hands and preaching the gospel. And so this is a very special place in our hearts, and it's so good to be with you today. And we certainly do, as Bill mentioned, all the prayers. We solicit you to continue to do that. She begins her treatment next Sunday, going to be able to stay at home at least hopefully, and just take some pills every day, but that's still not going to be easy on her. And quite frankly, Bill, I don't know how she does it. I stand in awe of her, but I made a good choice almost 44 years ago now. I will be seeing the doctor next Monday, a week from tomorrow, and he'll remove the other blockage that is in my heart. And so I've got complete confidence in God, and therefore in this surgeon. He did a wonderful job the other day, a couple weeks ago now, in spite of the difficulty of it. So I'm confident that it's going to go well too. So good to see Bill. It's always good to see Bill, especially good to see Gene. And told Bill that's why we came today, didn't come see him, so don't flatter yourself. Obviously, we're going to talk about Esther this morning, Esther chapter 4, as our text was there, for such a time as this. This book, of course, is centered around a king and two women. I mean, there are other characters, but those are the main characters. Vashti was the queen to begin with, as the book opens, for the king of Persia, Ahasuerus, and a problem developed because he wanted to call her in the midst of this feast that he was having, to present her, to really sort of show her off, it appears to be anyway, before all these other men. No doubt they were probably in a drunken state, and she had enough virtue to say, I'm not going to do it, I'm not going. Well, you know, you just don't refuse a king like that, especially in those days. That could be very, very dangerous to your health. But in this case, the consequence of it was that she was going to no longer be queen, and that would be taken from her, and so a new queen had to be found, and that, of course, ends up being Esther. Now, it's interesting. We'll talk a little bit more about this as we go through some of this. Esther then was chosen as the replacement. She was one of those taken into captivity in 586 BC. There was yet another carrying away into captivity prior to that, and then this one here. And so the Jews are in captivity, and they're scattered around all over the empire, the world as is now controlled by the Persians, starting out with the Babylonians, Medo-Persians, and of course eventually the Greeks and then the Romans. We're all familiar with that. We've studied that so much in the Old Testament. So we're in that second worldwide kingdom, the Medes and the Persians, and the Persians outshine the Medes on that. So we have to have a new queen, and in chapter 2, Esther is selected to be the new queen. Well, she immediately uncovers a plot against the king's life, tells the king about it. The guilty people are dealt with, but in the process, this fella by the name of Hammond is elevated to a position of authority, and quite frankly, he doesn't like Jews, and so he determines to find a way to eradicate all of the Jews that are out there. I guess just get rid of them all. So Hitler was not the first one to try to get rid of the Jewish people. He was one in a long line, no doubt, through history, who thought that they could eradicate at that time the people of God. Now I want to be very clear, they are no longer God's chosen people. In Jesus Christ there is neither Jew nor Gentile, male nor female, we're all one in Christ Jesus, but they were God's chosen people at that time, and God was not about to let some punk like Haman and even some king he served to do something about his people. He was going to preserve them. But but he needed somebody to step up to the plate, as he always does. And he always finds someone, even as we'll see that her cousin let her know, listen, if you don't, somebody else will. God will accomplish his purpose, but right now it was going to be time for Esther to decide whether she was that one or not. Well, what kind of a time was it? The lesson is entitled, For Such a Time as This. Well, what kind of time was it? It was, I would tell you, a time of extravagance. Now, I'm not saying that everybody lived in extravagance, but in the environment where Esther would find herself, we're talking about luxury and environment. And it seems like that they were just pleasure mad. Back in chapter 1, as I already alluded to, there was this great banquet lasting 7 days. Now, there's great banquets held today, and there's great celebrations today, but most of them don't go on that long. But this one did. These days were completed. The king gave a banquet lasting 7 days for all the people present in Susha, the capital, from the greatest to the least in the court of the garden of the king's palace. So this was just a pleasure-mad throng that we're dealing with here. And why not? He saw himself as standing at the top of the nations, and he was. The problem with these kings, though, was they didn't realize how they got there. They always thought they did it themselves, and that's why they boasted often about their great power. But we know they were only there because God put them there. And every ruler under the sun needs to remind themselves they are there because God wants them to be there for a certain purpose. Don't get the big head. You didn't really do it yourself. But most of them never looked high enough to see that plan that God had in mind. We see in our own time billions and billions of dollars spent on fun and recreation, and there's nothing wrong with some recreation. It's good. There's nothing wrong with enjoying some of the pleasures of life, depending on what they are. But when one gives themselves over to that, that's the problem. We're not to be given over to the pleasures of this world. Can we enjoy the things around us? Certainly we can. But we are not to allow that to just take over. What happens is that contributions to the Lord's work and gifts to religious organizations, I'm talking first of all generally out in society, they're not very large. It's amazing to me. Usually every time we have a presidential election, they will usually put out their tax returns. And it is amazing to see sometimes what a paltry amount is given by some of the candidates who are wealthy. Now, there are a few from time to time who give a respectable amount to various kinds of charity, but not a lot of them do. Many of them just simply spend it on their own pleasures. Well, that's not anything new. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, Paul wrote, and he said to Timothy that in the last days, difficult times will come, and they were in a period of last days, at least prior to the destruction of Jerusalem. Men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, malicious gossip, without self-control. This could describe our society, couldn't it? Think Charlotte, North Carolina. I was sickened by what I saw. People who think they have a right because of some perceived and probably real issue, think they have a right to go through the streets and tear up other people's businesses, their livelihood, that which they work. That's not protest. That's just simply people out of control. They have no self-control, just like this going on here. Brutal, haters of God, treacherous, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. But now the sad thing is that I don't think Paul was really talking about people necessarily out in the world holding to a form of godliness, although they've denied its power. Avoid such men as these. Christians succumb to the same thing. So a time of great extravagance. It was a time of drunkenness. one of the chief pleasures of the day. Again, in the description given of this great feast that was presented to everybody there by the king. And it's only though, you see, when we get to look at the results, when we see in the news a car that is torn all to pieces, do we get to see the end of what is called the finished product of the brewer's art. It should be, but the commercial was the choice product of the brewer's art. We shouldn't concentrate on that. What we need to see is the finished product of the brewer's art. The children afraid to see Dad coming home because they know he's probably going to beat them for very little or no reason. Why would he do that? He's drunk. He doesn't have the control that he ought to have. This is what alcohol does. Abraham Lincoln said, alcohol has many defenders, but no defense. You cannot defend the use of that at any level, although I've had Christians who beg to differ. Well, again, you see, there's the finished product of the brewer's art. But that's not what we see. We see the land of sky blue water. Remember that commercial? Oh, they make it look like it's such a great thing. No, this is what you need to focus on right here. This is the finished product of the brewer's art. Any different today? No, not really. It's only when we see the finished product that we begin to understand what a devastating thing that does, and it's always done that. In the book of Proverbs, and I was talking to one of Jane's classmates' husband, you know, when you go to these reunions and you're not a part of that school, you just kind of latch on to somebody else, usually that's not a part of it, and happened to be a good friend of hers there, and her husband was along. And so he and I did a lot of talking, and we talked about this. They're very religious people. They're members of the Nazarene Church, very devout Nazarenes, very, very good people. So we were talking about this, and, you know, it's like we said, how can anybody do this? What possible benefit is there to using these kind of alcoholic beverages? Well, there isn't any. And what is painted for us in words in the 23rd, Proverb 23, is so true. Who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has contentions? Who has complaining? Who has wounds without cause? Yes, this happens to people. Who has redness of the eyes? Those who linger long over wine. Those who go in to taste mixed wine. Do not look on the wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup. When it goes down smoothly, it bites like a serpent, and it stings like a viper. Your eyes will see strange things, and your mind will utter perverse things. And you'll be like one who lies down in the middle of the sea, like one who lies down on the top of a mast. In other words, you become 10 foot tall and bulletproof. You're not afraid of anything because you're under the influence of it. They struck me, but I did not become ill. They beat me. I didn't know it. Here's the sad part. When shall I awake? I will seek another drink. You'll right back and do the same thing over again. There's a word for that. When you keep doing the same thing and you keep getting the same bad results, that's called stupidity. And that's what we've got out there because people are pleasure mad, and alcohol is a big part of that. Let us not get caught up with that, brothers and sisters. Let the world have that. We don't need any part of that. There's the desecration of the marriage and the home. Now, Vashti was requested by the king to come out there and display her beauty. Now, I don't know everything that may have been involved in that, whether he expected her to just come out there and fully clothed and remain fully clothed, that she was a beautiful woman in her face and so forth. I don't know. Or was he expecting that she might come out there and show a little bit more to this drunken crowd? I don't know all of that. It doesn't say. But she knew what was expected. She knew what he wanted her to do, and she said, no. I'm not going to do that. Verse 12, Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. The king became very angry, and his wrath burned within him. He wasn't happy about that at all. Well, let me back up here just a little bit, talk about something else. Those that were around her thought, this is not very good. You know, this could lead to rebellion of women. They may very well have been putting down what they thought was one of the first women's liberation movements here. Their reasoning was this: if you let her get by with that, all women are going to do that, including their wives. So they had to figure out some way to do that. And of course, we know, as I already mentioned in the introduction, she was removed as queen. But look what is going on. What kind of time was it? What kind of time is it? Our divorce rate is still right around 50%, sometimes a little bit less, sometimes a little bit more within a year's period of time. But that's nothing to be proud of, that half of the people who enter into marriage don't remain in that marriage. And second marriages are higher than that as far as their divorce rate. Home and marriage have now been redefined. Yeah. We grew up thinking that in order to have a family, you had a husband and a wife, and then you had some children that came along. Now we're told, no, Heather's got two mommies, a popular book several years ago that kids were reading in school. I'm glad that never came up when my boys were in school, because the school would have heard about that. I think that was a little bit after that. But now we're told, no, you cannot narrowly define the home that way. A home could have two women in a relationship with children. They could have two men in a relationship with children. That's just as valid a definition as yours, with one man, one woman, married to each other and children. I'm waiting, and I don't think it'll be very long, for someone to come on down to the courthouse in tow with two women and say, I want to marry this woman right here. Well, that's not a problem. He said, well, I'm already married to her. Now I want to marry her as well. Well, no, wait a minute. We can't. What do you mean you can't allow that? There's no definition for marriage anymore. There'll probably be somebody go down to the courthouse and want to marry their dog before it's all over with. And if you don't have a definition that can stand the test, then what's wrong with that? Well, there isn't anything wrong with that. A long time ago, this lesbian, Patricia Neal Warren, said whoever captures the kids owns the future. Now, that doesn't really take a whole lot of brains to think of that, but she's the one who said it. And they ought to know, because they have been poisoning the minds of youth now for several decades. They gave up on us old folks. They knew they would never convince people my age or older that it's all right for two women to get married or for two men to get married. They don't even bother with trying to convince us. But they start with our children and our grandchildren, and they put that in their head. And that's the reason why now when they do polls, if they're accurate, I'm not sure they are, supposedly the approval rating for same-sex marriage is getting higher all the time. I'm never too sure about any poll, to be quite frank about it, because people are hesitant when someone is standing there asking them a question to appear to be narrow-minded. And so very often they may answer it the other way because they don't want anybody to think badly of them. Now, the truth is, in a private conversation, they might just say the opposite thing. So I'm not too sure if those polls are completely accurate, but there's some accuracy to it. The number of people who are approving of same-sex marriage is obviously higher than it was a few years ago. So this was a time when marriage and the home were desecrated. Vashti refused to do what he wanted her to do. She wasn't going to go out there, whatever state that he wanted her to appear before all of those. Wasn't going to do it. Not doing it. Not doing it. She had respect for their relationship, and he didn't. It was a time when human life was cheap, really. They were going to just wipe out a whole nation of people, just like that. Just because Hammond made up a story about them, they were going to be destroyed. Over here in the 3rd chapter, we read here verses 9 through 11. If it is pleasing to the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who carry on the king's business to put into the king's treasury. And so the plan was approved by the king, and he was given the silver. Here's your silver, and the people also to do with them as you please. So Haman set out then to systematically destroy all of the Jews throughout the empire, just like that. No regard for human life. That sound familiar? We have to deal with abortion. Probably some 73 million abortions since 1973, and that's the legal ones. Yeah. Kill them. There's nothing there. That's just a piece of flesh. That's not a human being. And some citizens of ours and some politicians, if they could, they would allow for an abortion a day before birth. And by all rights and logically, there should be no objection on their part to that. Why not wait a day before the baby's to be born and go ahead and abort it? If life doesn't begin in the mind of some of them until the baby's born, then it's not a human up until that very point in time. Now, thankfully, the law doesn't allow that. But if some had their way, it would. And the horrors of some of the methods of these abortions, they're horrendous. The late-term abortion, you basically just reach in there, pull that skull out, and crush it. And we're supposed to be a humane group of people? All kinds of killings in schoolyards. We're seeing all kinds of shootings going on. We're seeing euthanasia. You know, as you get older, you get a little bit more concerned about that. Wait a minute here, when you're young, first of all, you think you're not going to get sick anyway. But as you get older and your body starts wearing out, and it's going to, for every one of us, you begin to think about that. You get on Medicare, and you begin to think, well, wait a minute, if someday the resources became much more limited, who's going to get the surgery they need? Somebody in their 80s or somebody in their 50s or 40s? Well, that'll be an easy one to answer. They're going to put us old folks on a list. And we may not even live long enough to get what we need, because they're going to protect the younger ones, because the younger ones are putting money into the system. The older ones are taking it out. They don't care about us. And we say, oh, that could never happen. We don't have enough people in this country that would allow that. Yes, we do. We got enough people to allow abortion. Why should they be concerned about people on the other end of life? What shall we say to this? We say to this the same thing the Bible's always said. Human life is precious to God. Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. After the flood, in the 9th chapter of Genesis, verses 5 and 6, our God decreed that human life is precious, and that when someone comes along and willfully takes human life, his life is to be taken. Genesis 9, the covenant that God made with mankind after the flood, including, of course, that he would not again destroy the earth by a flood. He says here, surely I will require your lifeblood from every beast I will require it, and from every man's brother, I will require the life of man. Now, these people out there who are opposed to capital punishment on religious grounds, they need to go back and read the Bible. It is so plain. God said, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. Why the distinction? You can kill an animal and you're not worthy of death. Well, some of them would make it that way. Here's why. For in the image of God he made man. Don't ever oppose capital punishment. That meets with God's approval. Someone says, well, now wait a minute. How can you oppose abortion but approve of capital punishment? Well, it's a very simple question to answer. It's the difference in not the fact that they're both human, but that baby, that's innocent human life. The murderer is guilty, and God said when you kill someone, your life is to be taken so that people understand just how serious a matter that is. That's where our government should be on capital punishment, but they don't always find themselves on that page, but that's where they ought to be. They ought to be upholding it. Then, of course, in Romans chapter 13 and verse 4, it talks about a sword, and that God does not bear the sword in vain. Well, what's the sword? That's an instrument of death. God gave civil government the right to put criminals, not just the right, the responsibility to put murderers to death. Well, the next thing we want to talk about here is, we know what kind of time it was, and it's pretty much like ours. Esther understood, as Mordecai told her, there's going to be no escape. Just because you're over here in the king's house, don't think that you will escape. It's going to affect every household. That's what he's trying to get across to her. Now listen, you're not going to escape destruction. You and your family are going to be destroyed just like all the rest of us. Now, she has hidden her heritage. I've always wondered, how they somehow didn't find that out till they did. But she goes through that whole process and becomes queen and has hidden the fact that she is a Jew. But that's not going to stay hidden forever, and Mordecai is letting her know, you're going to pay the penalty just like the rest of it. You see, the problem is, because of wickedness in the world, we all have to, in this sense, breathe that foul air. We all have to deal with wickedness, though we may be striving very hard to keep ourselves free from sin. But our adversary out there, he gets everybody that he can. For Satan, you see, Peter said, is like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. He doesn't care who it is, so long as he can devour somebody. I believe he works overtime on us. But we are not immune. Just because we become a child of God, there is not some protection put around us by God so that we are never tempted. No, we're still going to be tempted. James talks about that in chapter 1. So we cannot escape the wickedness that is in this world. We're not supposed to move up on top of a mountain to get away from it. We're going to be affected by it, and that's what Esther needed to understand. Everybody is going to be affected by that. It's going to spill over the garden walls. I guess especially being a preacher and associating primarily with Christians who for the most part are the best people on the face of the earth, gathering will not be any better until we gather in the very presence of God. Right now, the best we can get, the closest we can get to that is when we assemble with the saints, wherever they might be. That's as close as we can get to that for time being. And so if we spend most of our time with our fellow Christians, and we do need to spend time with them, it's easy to forget there's an evil, wicked world out there. And we can, when you go to work, you have to associate with the evil that's out there. But it's awfully easy to kind of forget about, I'm a part of the church and I've got such great people to be around. But it's out there and it affects all of us. It spills over the walls. Look at the crop of politicians we get every time. Some would lead us into sinful things and ought not be supported for that reason. But we have a responsibility. What's our responsibility? Have no fellowship with the unfruitful deeds of darkness. Well, that's the easy part of that verse, I believe. As hard as it is to avoid having fellowship with things that are sinful, it's much harder, I think, to do what the rest of the verse says. But instead, reprove them. We don't like that reproving business. It puts us at odds with other people. It forces us, like Esther, to stand up and say, no, I'm not going to do that. I can't participate with you in that. I'm a Christian. I have a responsibility to be an example to the world. We must, as Paul told Timothy, defend the faith. Paul had obeyed the gospel. He was a preacher himself, and he needed to be reminded. Apparently, Paul thought so, and so he did remind him about his responsibility in several different places. But here in chapter 6, verse 12, he said, fight the good fight of faith. Take hold of eternal life to which you're called, and made the good confession in the presence of many witnesses. Fight the good fight of faith. You see that word fight? Fight the good fight of faith. 2 times in that verse talks about fighting. Listen, being a child of God is not easy. But being a child of God means we stand up and we are counted on God's side just exactly like Esther did. Now, what's required of the faithful? Jude said we must earnestly contend for the faith. I'm going to have to move on here. Be preaching till supper. There were several people gathered, just to take an aside here for a moment. Several people gathered out in the lobby while I was having my procedure a couple weeks ago, and I found out later that as the doctor came in and explained what he'd been able to do, and they got to having a conversation about how that, let's see, that'll increase the blood flow. And one of the dear sisters there in the congregation said, you know what, he might even be a better preacher, more blood flowing. And that idea was kind of tamped down by one of the brethren. He said, no, I don't know about that. But I said, now he's going to remember more, he can preach longer. so she didn't get the answer she's looking for on that. Well, anyway, back to the point here. What is required of the faithful? Be people who will not bow down. Mordecai refused to bow down, and so Haman was especially after Mordecai. But you see, he had decided to be faithful to God. Even as the apostles in the New Testament, we ought to obey God rather than men. We cannot help but do what we're doing. You do what you think you got to do, but we're going to keep on preaching and teaching. They were not people who were silent, and we can't be people who are silent. And this was the reminder here in the text that was read for you in chapter 4, verse 14. If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you've not attained order for such a time as this. Great example of the providence of God, obviously. Reminding Esther, look, it just might be that this whole thing of Vashti losing the opportunity to remain as queen, you've now been selected as queen. You're in a position, if anybody can, you can stop this business of exterminating your own people. But now if you don't, God's going to accomplish it another way. But you've got an opportunity to stand up here. And so she decided, of course, that she would risk her life to do that. Perhaps it's a reminder of the same passage we know in Matthew 10. Fear not them that can destroy your body, but fear him that can destroy both body and soul and hair. There was an appreciation and a fear. She wanted to do the right thing. And that's what concerned people are going to do. They're going to have faith and they're going to have the courage to act. And so she went in and she went before the king. And all of this, of course, turned out the way it should have as we go through the rest of the book and read it all. It's a very interesting read, of course. All of it came about the way God wanted it to because she had the courage to do something about it. She stood up when it was her time to stand up and did something about it, and that is what is required of the faithful. The passage there in Luke 14, verse 26 talks about sometimes family, you know, they'll be in the way. They will be the ones opposing the very thing that you need to do. Well, then you have to make a decision. Who am I going to serve? If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father, mother, wife, and children, and brothers, and sisters, yea, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. There is a separation to be made, and serving God is the most important thing. And if that means separating myself from my family, then so be it. Well, what if I'm not willing to run the risk? What if I don't feel like I've got enough courage to sometimes stand up and do what I need to do? Well, is there somebody else willing to stand up? Support them in it at least. There was a show of support here for what Esther wanted to do. Strengthen the hands of those that teach. Sometimes we say, well, you know, I'd like to teach, but I can't. Well, you might be able to learn. Meanwhile, though, as Paul encouraged the Galatians there, you can help strengthen those who are willing to do it. Help uphold them. The Philippians, Paul made a point in chapter 4, verse 14, how they had helped him. They had been a source of strength to him. And I want to make a final point here, and that's going to be yours. There will be a time of victory. It came in the book of Esther. She played, of course, a leading role in that. We're not going to go through all the details of that. Esther identified Haman as the instigator of the plot to destroy her people. And we know how that turned out. He was hung on the very gallows that he prepared for Mordecai. The king retracted the law that had been instigated falsely against the Jews, and victory became complete. Mordecai, in fact, was promoted to a high office in the land. Listen, folks, when you stand up and do what's right, God's going to watch out for you. He really will. Sometimes we have trouble believing that, and so we give in. They had victory over their enemies. The feast Purim was instituted. Victory is great, and God will give us victory if we stand with him. And if we overcome all the obstacles that get in our way, we will have that crown of life Paul talked about in 2 Timothy 4. That was waiting for him. I fought a good fight. He said, I've finished the course. I've kept my faith. Henceforth, kept the faith. Henceforth, there's laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me in that day. Not me only, he said, but all them who love his appearing. But we got to overcome. Change begins where? We sometimes think it begins with somebody else. No, it begins with me. And it begins with you. Are you allowing God to use you in his service, like he used Esther? Who knows at such a time as this? The providence of God is a wondrous thing. We cannot always know for sure. Sometimes Joseph seemed to know. I know why I was down here in captivity, but sometimes you can't figure it out. But it doesn't mean God isn't working in his providence, using each one of us to accomplish his purpose. If you're here this morning and you're not a child of God, he can't use you. You need to become a Christian. You need to express your faith in Jesus Christ as the Son of God. Change your mind, determine to do differently. Repent of your sins, confess your faith, and then be baptized, immersed in water for remission of sins. If that's what you need to do, everything's ready, I'm sure. And if you've wandered away, your Heavenly Father wants you to come back so he can use you again to accomplish his purpose. But you let us know as we stand and sing. I am resolved.